that was that. Oh, and then there was that. So that's Spielberg watching Jurassic World. Blue, I believe. Was it Blue or Apatosaurus that he was watching there? Yeah, it was Blue, yeah. So sure enough, when we did the next one, they were like, okay, enough sleeping dinosaurs. We actually want, the T-Rex and more action. And what was interesting about this one is it's something I would have liked to talk about later. Can we come back to this after we talk about...
There's no way, man. Everything is so tightly prepared.
Let's do that. I'm gonna mix things up here and go off script.
So,
yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, you can take it.
Yeah. So then another fun thing happened at that time. As the boundaries of the virtual reality were expanding for us and our studio started to shape up, we became a company, and we found investors. Phi became a partner. So the company started to shape up from a creative standpoint, and from a technology standpoint, things were growing. And then we got a call from the White House. True.
Oh, shit.
I get excited even after all these years. We had a business relationship with Facebook at the time, and we were doing projects with them. They were financing a lot of the projects that we were doing because they wanted to have premium content on their platform. They were financing gaming content and cinematic virtual reality content. And so through contacts that they had with the White House, we got in touch with them, and they told us the president has seen projects that you have made and is interested in having you pitch ideas in regards to what we could do together. And so we had kind of a heartbreak, kind of sort of like, what's going on? This is like beyond crazy. And so we said, sure, no problem. We'll get back to you by Monday. So we came up with concepts, and we pitched them 3 different ideas. And it turned out that he was about to go on an official trip in Yosemite National Park with his family, with his 2 daughters and wife, the First Lady. And so they asked us, hey, do you want to document this journey and make a piece about the National Park Centennial, which we did. And so we traveled with them to Yosemite, and we produced that piece. And then it had a very great response. It was distributed as a virtual reality experience, but also as 360 video. So that was in the years where 360 video was a new thing. You could make a project that people would see on headsets, but you could also output it as monoscopic 360 content. So anybody with a cell phone or a mobile device could just use their mobile device to pan around. Less immersive, but still, given that there are billions of people with mobile devices, a good way to reach an audience and bridge the gap between now and the day that everybody will have immersive glasses. So President Obama saw the result, he liked it, and he said, why don't we do another one? Which was even more crazy. So, and so we went back to the main idea that we pitched in the first place, the one that we really wanted to do, because that was in 2016. We wanted to create a piece that would be like a presidential memoir, or create a piece where you're sort of traveling through the memories of the president as he's finishing his 8-year term at the White House. And we wanted to reflect on the meaning of place, like the meaning of, oh, thank you, man. So what it means to live in a place that is so central to the attention of the world, a place that is a historical place that has a very profound history, a space that is also a working environment where you go to work every day, and inside of that same space you're also raising children. That's where your kids grow. That's where you have your dog and all that. And so we thought this space is very specific in the world and has all of these multi-layers. And so, and they liked that concept, and so we started to work with the digital strategy team at the White House to sort of make that happen. Filming virtual reality inside the White House is not simple. We even filmed inside of the Situation Room. So you might have seen pictures of Situation Room. That is that famous picture of Obama and Hillary Clinton all looking at the Osama bin Laden operation. That photo was taken inside of Situation Room. So we got to film in that place. We had to work with the Secret Service people that were very collaborative. And it was a very emotional time. It was right before the 2016 election. And so the president and his family, they were very generous. They gave a lot of time to the project, and it just turned out into something that we're extremely proud of. That was a very high moment, a big honor for us to do this.
I'll stay on that a second. So this is what I wanted to talk about before talking about Jurassic. One of the biggest things we did here for the first time was move the camera. This was the first time we actually moved the camera. I believe we had moved it before in a vehicle, like in Nomads. At some point, you're in a little canoe kind of thing, and it's moving. But this was the first time we moved the camera on its own. And the way we did this in this project was almost everything we'd ever shot, and to this day, almost everything we shoot is from a sitting position, because that's the position in which you physically are when you put on a headset, or at least it's what we recommend. We shoot everything from that angle. That totally adds to the immersion, to the presence. When we moved the camera in this project, the way we did it was we kept the camera at sitting height and we moved it very slowly. And we only did it in the shots that were of the White House rooms, and not during the scenes when you're talking to, when Barack or Michelle are talking to you. So the scenes with Barack and Michelle were kind of like strangers. You're sitting next to them and they're talking to you. But then when they're talking about something, then we have these floating, slow floating, oddly, positioned cameras that really give you this.
Oh, that's my parking. So keep going.
Yeah. It really gives you this inner, this feeling of a memory, of a thought, because really he's talking about, he and she were talking about their time at the White House. They were talking about the history of the White House. This was actually going to come out. This was shot in the period of time after Trump was elected, but before the Obamas left office. So we knew that this was the past as we were shooting it. And sure enough, it came out at Tribeca a few months later, once Trump was in power. So the whole thing here was, we didn't want to simulate someone walking when you wouldn't be walking yourself, and that's one of the things we've actually never done to this day. So it was a very deliberate way of moving the camera. And just to come back to quickly, I think we're running behind, so I'm going to do this quickly. But the thing we did on Jurassic World Blue, the second Jurassic piece we did, was we also moved the camera. But this time we didn't have the luxury of, well, it's a memory. No, there's not only is this not a memory, this is happening in real time, and there are no humans on the island. This is set at the moment between the two movies where there's no one on the island. And the way we justified the movement in this piece was, well, we're going to make this a non-subjective point of view of the dinosaur, which is this kind of mental contortion, but it kind of worked. The idea was you are not Blue, the dinosaur, you're with Blue in quotes. You're basically an extension of her senses. And so we have, again, a low height, slow moving camera, but we're constantly following Blue. And this was the closest thing we've ever done to a purely cinematic camera, what could be considered or seen as a cinematic camera. But it really was a slow, this project came out, I think, 1.5, 2 years ago, a slow progression to the exploration of what a moving camera can be. All right, let's move forward. Still me. All right. Cirque du Soleil. So as you might know, we've had a long relationship and collaboration with the Cirque du Soleil, starting before we were even doing virtual reality. We have since done, I believe, 5 VR experiences with them, and we just shot our 6th last week. And the way we've approached this from the beginning was, we're not recording their shows, we're adapting them. The same way you would adapt a book into a film, we start from the show and we adapt it into a VR experience. So we base ourselves on the characters, on the performances, on the props. And if you see the progression, this is the first one we did, it was kind of a reorchestration of the original show and in its shortened timeline. The more we progressed, the further and further we got from what these shows originally were. So if you've seen it in Vegas, there's this incredible pool of water that the performance happens on and around and in, but you're seeing it from outside the water, whereas the experience we created was almost entirely underwater and this kind of dreamlike psychedelic experience. So quite removed from the original show. And again, this just speaks to how fundamentally different virtual reality is, not only from cinema, but from live theater as well. And there's just things in common, but a lot of things that need to be adapted when you cross over.
So I'll go quickly on this one so that we can maybe get back the time that we lost when you were talking.
That I wasted?
Yeah.
Hey, you started it.
So Miyubi is our first attempt at creating a long-form project. So Miyubi is a 40-minute scripted narrative. It stars Jeff Goldblum and Owen Vaccaro. It's actually it's a comedy, so we did that in collaboration with Will Ferrell's company, Funny or Die. And we started from a concept that would justify the fact that you are there as a viewer and that you are somewhat limited because, as you know, cinematic virtual reality, as of today, does not allow you to stand up and walk around as if you were in a real-time experience, for example. And so we thought, okay, well, you're going to be a robot, like a sort of a cheap plastic toy robot in 1982 that is gifted to a boy for his birthday. And you will see your little robotic buddy. You will always feel like you're approximately 2 feet high. And the nature of the experience is going to be your interaction with all of the different family members. And so you become a privileged witness to the family dynamics between the different family members and the dynamics that they have with you. And so that was interesting because it's the first time we also started to think about dramatic arcs that involves the viewer. And so how do you create a satisfying dramatic arc for the character of the viewer, you know, and how do you make that arc, how do you synergize that arc with the arc of the main characters, which was an interesting tackle.
And what was important here is, you know, we got really, by putting the viewer at the center of the experience, we had to be very careful not to fall into what we call the uncanny valley of presence, where you feel so present that you're like, well, I should be able to do more than I'm actually allowed to do or able to do. And that's why the robot concept kind of inherently limited what you could do to begin with. And that's something, you know, we think about a lot in all our experiences. So, Marshall from Detroit was, after, this was done last year, after 5 years of having done Strangers, which was our first experience ever, but was also a musical experience, you know, from the time we had done Strangers, we were convinced that VR and the music world, and just music in general, were this, you know, match made in heaven. And we proceeded to meet with, or try to reach out to every imaginable artist on the planet, to varying successes of communicating with them, but to absolute failure of actually getting anything done with anyone in the music industry for 5 years. It was kind of a music curse, so to speak, that finally broke when we finally worked with Marshall on this piece. He was incredibly enthusiastic about the medium and just an incredible person to work with. What was much like Patrick, it took someone who was, you know, fundamentally interested in the medium and wanted to really give themselves to this experimentation to make the piece. Another interesting thing, I've been talking about editing a lot. This project was the first time we actually did cuts, like straight cuts, and the reason and the way we did it was when, you know, most of the pieces is you're in a car with Marshall and his friend Sway as they're having a conversation, and it's kind of a cam lock. And so we were using that as a way to ease the transition between the cuts. So basically it's just everything, you're not cutting from one place to another, we're just kind of skipping in time. And that was, you know, a way to add rhythm to a piece that, you know, was a little more, you know, just because of the musicality, you know, the hip hop, you know, there's something with more energy and rhythm inherent to it. But it also allowed us to, you know, get a lot of, you know, get around what he was saying and make it more concise and get more impact out of the interview. Me again. Isle of Dogs was a collaboration with Wes Anderson. So this was actually directed by Wes Anderson. We were really there to facilitate his exploration of the medium, and we brought the whole technological aspect. What was really fun about this, it was the first time we did stop motion. It was the first time we also played with scale. So we actually, if you've seen the piece, the puppets themselves are usually about this big, but in the experience, they look like life-sized dogs, which was amazing to work on because you get to see these puppets essentially come to life, literally, in the piece. And the fun thing about this one is that, talking about editing again, when you're looking in front of you, you're in the world of the film, and when you look behind you, you're literally on the set, which is how it's made, right? You don't have 360-degree sets on stop motion usually. So it's a fun way to have a making of and a piece at the same time, which is really cool.
So Space Explorer, so this is something we started in 2016, so we're big fans of space exploration. It's just something that we've been interested in since we were kids. And we were thinking at some point when we are ready, when we have figured out enough things from a technological and creative standpoint, we should start telling the story of space exploration moving forward through virtual reality, through immersive media. And so we pitched that idea to NASA in 2016, and they became supportive of it. And so we rallied the participation of multiple astronauts and multiple NASA executives, and we began to tell the story of the present and future of space exploration. So we made 2 episodes of 20 minutes each, and we collaborated also with the Russian space agency, Roscosmos. We also created a partnership with SpaceX, and so we produced that series over a period of 2 years. And so that's another thing that happened over time, is that we started by production that would wrap within a day to production that would start to extend over time in the same way that cinema productions would. The one principle that was the guiding light for space exploration, or space explorers, was the same that has been a guiding light for us from the very beginning 15 years ago, was to continue to think of what the camera represents. And in that project, we thought, well, the camera needs to be like an astronaut. The camera needs to be someone who is at the heart of the journey of space exploration, and we need to place the camera everywhere an astronaut would go, or everywhere an astronaut could be. And it needs to feel like you belong inside of that relatively exclusive world that is the world of the astronauts, and that you really have a room, and that you really are accepted within that community. And so that led us to place the camera inside of a T-38 supersonic jet, because that's how astronauts trained for spaceflight. And then we had to find a ways to counteract the intense vibrations of supersonic flight, and that became a pretty big deal for our engineers, but the shot works really well. We also had to find a way to immerse the camera underwater for almost a day, because that's what astronauts do. That's where they go to train for spacewalk. They train inside of a one-to-one full-scale replica of the International Space Station that's in Houston. And so we had to find a technological way to do that in order to pursue this idea of the viewer being an astronaut. We also went to New Mexico to do a filming session in the White Sands Desert, and we had to deal with sandstorms inside of that environment, but we got to play with cool toys, as you can see here. And eventually we ended up pushing it a little too far when we tried to film a SpaceX rocket launch from very close, and our camera actually melted, and it's a pretty expensive piece of technology, and we captured that photo of that day, which was...
We got the shot, though.
Yeah, we got the shot, because we had found a way to separate the data recording from the camera unit. And so the camera melted, but not the data. And the shot is pretty cool, but it cuts at a certain point, like the rocket goes up, and then that's it. Like,
once the rocket is literally just shooting fire right into the camera, that's about where it
That's
cuts.
the melting moment where there was no longer a recording process happening. And yeah, so we prepared that pretty slide that's called Q&A. I guess it means something.
I guess that's my cue. So as you can see, we've done a lot of, I mean, the guys have done a lot of projects since the studio started. What you saw was just a taste of it. The studio has over 20 works now in its catalog, and if you haven't gone there yet, we are showcasing some of the pieces at the Complexe Desjardins with the VR cinema there. But yeah, so we're a bit over time, but I think it was nice to hear about all the different projects. We probably have time for 2 or 3 questions before we move on, because really what we wanted to share further with you guys is what's currently in production and do a little bit of a case study around those. So are there any questions in the audience so far? And we'll just grab a couple. Yeah, right here in the front.
Someone have a mic or?
Yeah, we can just.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious to know what you think about, and are you evaluating light field photography in terms of immersive experiences? I know we're not there yet, but I would like to have your idea about it.
Should I use our in-house put a pin in it? We're going to talk about that in a few slides. Do you mind waiting for that? Yeah? All right, cool.
Thank you.
Well, that was an easy question.
Hi. Clearly, a lot of remarkable work, but I think in the world at large, it's unique where you'd go in a room and so many people would raise their hand and say they're familiar with your work and they've seen your work. How far are we from a time when this type of work can be shared with a wider audience, where you don't need expensive equipment to watch it, where the technology, where more people can start to experience immersive cinema in this way?
Yeah. We're going to talk about that later. No. So there's a few things. First of all, VR and basically any head-mounted type of display, whether it's AR, VR, or both, today is not an essential piece of technology, and it's cumbersome, and there's no real ritual around doing that. We have the ritual of the cinema, we have the ritual of Netflix, of YouTube, of things we know how to do that are part of our lives. VR and AR are not that yet. So that's going to take a while just from a societal, cultural kind of perspective. But the hardware itself needs to become much more comfortable, much lighter. The content needs to become more essential. Today, I think the reason Oculus and all these companies targeted the gaming market first was because it's kind of a way to shortcut to a market, right? Whereas the real market is everyone. And what the real thing that needs to replace is every digital device, which is our smartphones, our screens, our computer screens, our, whatever, all the screens. For that to happen, we need to not just have great games and great cinematic, entertaining content. We need to find new paradigms for what email or Facebook or Excel or any application that we use daily, or professional applications, education. All of these things are slowly going to. I mean, one thing that is it seems to us inevitable and just a matter of time, because it's such a more profoundly useful and more natural way to interact with anything, right? It isn't quite fully yet because of the clunkiness and limitations, but it's certainly pointing towards, and it's evolving at a speed that's fast enough where, it's always, you can on stuff for that's going to be a big thing, because, they have a tendency to shift cultural adoption very quickly. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So my question comes from something that you've repeated once in a while about putting the camera as a character, either literally with Miyubi where you're in the body of a character, or otherwise where you're just present as any other character would be. And it feels like it's tied with the title of your talk, the Unlearning Cinematic Conventions, where it seems like a lot of early VR cinema literally put people in the body of a character, and this has worked so-so. So I'm wondering if you have discovered certain tendencies, certain strategies rather, that work better for putting the people in the movie. You mentioned eventually the possibility of being able to stand up and walk. This is not something we can do right away, but I'm wondering if you feel like there's certain essential things that are better for immersing a person in as a character in the movie.
You want to take that, or? No, you're on a roll. All right. So I talked briefly about Blue and how that was not actually really you embodying anyone, really. You by proxy, you were really closely connected to Blue. So that was the closest thing I think we did to something that was, you're not really anyone. And in a similar way, what we did on the Obama piece, you're not really anyone there either. You're kind of in this memory, inner thought kind of thing. Honestly, to be walking around and doing stuff, we are exploring that, but not in cinematic virtual reality. We're exploring it in interactive, real-time rendered, where you literally walk around. It seems, at least so far in our exploration, that the minute you do that, but you don't actually, you're not actually controlling your movement, that it creates a lot of discomfort, and B, a lot of dissonance. Like you no longer, you're like, I'm clearly not doing, this is putting too much, it's too much imposition on someone. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible, because a lot of the things we did, I would have thought were not possible years before. We just haven't really done it or figured out how to do it well. But in an interactive situation, absolutely, and then there are all sorts of other challenges, and we'll talk a bit about that later, that come with interactivity. But yeah, that makes sense.
You guys might talk about that later too, but we just shot something. You just sent a VR camera to space. David Saint-Jacques was testing that. When can we expect to see something made out of that? And we're coming back to the moon in a few years. Do you guys have any plan to send a virtual us to the moon?
That
yes.
is,
So, I mean, that's the next.
that's a great segue, yeah.
So it's a pin it for later, but the later is now. So can I?
Yeah, so I think I know there's a lot of questions in the audience, but we actually have a full-blown section that we still want to get to share with you, and that involves a lot with space explorers. I know we're technically scheduled here until about 11:30, but I'm looking at Katayun to see if we can steal a bit more time since we started a bit later.
Yes, we can stay until 12.
Okay. Well, let's see if you guys are willing to stay until 12, but we certainly have a section where we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into space explorers. It's actually evolved into one of our current productions. Really exciting case study on that. Time permitting, we've got a little bit more on Miyubi Traveling While Black, which is one of our most critically received pieces that was released this year.
Well received.
Well received. What did I say?
Critically received.
Oh, I'm equating that with well received. And then we'll have another Q&A at the very end. So thank you, hang tight, and we'll get to more questions after this.
Okay, so yeah, so we wanted to talk specifically about that topic in a more of a case study form, but we ended up taking so much time talking about the other stuff that it's going to be the same time dedicated to this, probably. One thing that the process of working with NASA led to is, as we were starting to meet with astronauts and get the support from astronauts who love virtual reality as a medium, and the experiences that we have created for space explorers, the participating astronauts were starting to share that with their families and with people, and so it became a thing within NASA, and I would say that most employees at NASA ended up seeing the initial episodes of Space Explorers. And once we started to see that there was internal support, and then the piece was also very well received, then we said, well, maybe that's sufficient momentum to propose to send virtual reality cameras to space and to document over the course of a year life on board of the International Space Station. And so we pitched.
I just want to add something here. One of the reasons they gave for that was that it was the first time they felt that any medium captured their reality in as good a way as virtual reality does. They had done IMAX, they had done obviously live webcasts, movies, all sorts of things, and obviously you can't physically go there, and they were like, this is the first time I can show my family, my friends, anyone really, something that actually approximates the experience of anything we're doing, really.
So basically, NASA presented to us all of the steps that would be required in order to do that. And if we were to send our own camera technology, it would have taken us probably 2.5 years to certify the camera and send it to the International Space Station. So in this case, we did something that we had never done before. We made a partnership with an existing camera company called Zcam, and we used their technology, which was already a commercial product, so it would shorten the time of flight certification. And we basically modified that camera, integrated that camera to technologies that our engineers seen through SpaceX 18 to the ISS, and we began production in January of this year, and we're going to wrap up production in early 2020. So we're filming over the course of 1 year, approximately 100 shots with the astronauts in space, and so we have the participation of all of the astronauts, and now we're working to try to get the cosmonauts involved in the project as well, because we want to tell that part of the story. And this will lead to next year, the next phase in this project, which will be to capture an actual spacewalk in virtual reality. So we're developing a separate technology initiative to be able to take a virtual reality camera outside of the ISS in the vacuum of space to film astronauts coming out of the station and working on the station, as well as capture shots of planet Earth, you know, that have zero sort of station interference, and of course capture establishing shots of the station. So hopefully using Canadian arm as a kind of a big jib, that you would say in cinema, to move the camera around and get all of these shots. And it's what we're actually working on at the moment. So it's the kid in me and the adult in me are both excited by all this. We have a teaser that I think I should show. It's a partnership with Time, this project that we're doing in space, and they produced this teaser to announce the project.
Transferring to orbiter internal. 6, 7, 12, and 13.
There's a lot that goes into sending anything up into space.
CV2 copies.
Copy that, guys.
Luca from Houston, give us the status.
The dream was always to transport the viewer to space and feel like they have truly been to the International Space Station.
We've never attempted something of this degree. The complexity, the magnitude.
The first principle is placing the camera where a person could be.
Everywhere I think you're going to want that is where people won't want to put it.
Everything is being scrutinized at every step of the way. It's a closed system, and if anything goes wrong, you can't call the fire department in space. Cameras have been sent up before, but none with this complexity.
I think there are some subject matters that are better experienced. Virtual reality is the perfect medium.
There's something that's so intangible about living in zero gravity.
Only trained astronauts live and work on the International Space Station. The actual purpose of the work,
We're go for EVA.
it's ultimately about all of us.
Can you guys see this? Awesome.
So to answer your questions of earlier, when will that be seen? So we are, as I mentioned producing this piece until next year. We are hoping to launch two things, a cinematic virtual reality series divided in 6 episodes, as well as a large-scale traveling exhibition that will tour North America and that will tour the world. And the virtual reality content is going to be the central focus of the large-scale traveling exhibition. And so we're designing both these things for a hopefully 2020, 2021 release calendar. And so we're working on those details at the moment. Maybe a few things that I can say about...
He also asked about the moon.
Oh, yeah. So the answer is yes. Everything that we're developing, of course, the relationships, the creative approach, the participation of the astronauts, and of course, the technological platform that we're developing for filming inside and filming outside of the space station, all of that, we see that as a sort of a test bed, ultimately, to be able to produce a version 2.0 of the technology platform that we're developing in order to be able to go further into deep space and document the upcoming steps in the history of human spaceflight. And so moon mission is the obvious next step. And so we're working on that at the moment. Well, not right now, but, well, not me right now, but people are doing that at the moment at the office is what I mean. Okay, so maybe, yeah, just to mention that working with astronauts is pretty extraordinary. So this is someone you probably have seen before, David Saint-Jacques, our Canadian astronaut. He's working with our virtual reality space camera. You can see our logo. When I saw that photo, I wanted to cry. To see my logo in space, I was so proud. Anyway, so this is the virtual reality camera system. And this was the first day of principal photography inside of Node 2 on the space station. And one thing we can say about working with astronauts is that they are, well, as you probably guess, very smart people, very fast learners, very resourceful. And when you work with them, you realize that they are your whole crew. You know, as a filmmaker, you're used to working with a director of photography, with a soundman, with you know, like a producer, someone who you know, figures out the filming strategy, and a director, and all of that. But when you work with astronauts, they are all of those things all at the same time. They have to be that for you. So we occasionally have communication, sometimes by phone, sometimes via email, but most of the time they end up utilizing the camera. And they have to do everything, you know. They have to operate the camera, they have to follow the procedures, they have to put their own lav mic in order to record the sound. They have to plug back the camera for data transfer. So you're relying on them to become the whole film crew into one person, which is pretty extraordinary. So the quality of communication and the quality of the relationship that you develop with them is essential in order for that unusual process to be successful. So here's US astronaut Nick Hag working again with the virtual reality camera in the US lab. One thing that I wanted to share with you is how a filming process generally goes. I thought that that might be of interest for you. And so when we are filming in space, generally what we see is a video camera pointing at our VR system in context. So this is what you have to the right. And so we see where our camera is positioned in space. And we can adjust camera position if need be by communication with space. And then once the setup is sort of validated, then what we see is what the camera sees, basically, which is this image. It's a kind of a broken, sliced image, but it still kind of gives you a sense of what you're filming. And the astronaut is generally responsible for triggering the whole recording process, but it can also be done from the ground through Houston, if need be. So do you want to talk about Traveling While Black?
Yes. So Traveling While Black is one of the latest experiences we've released earlier this year. Basically, it's for those who know about the Green Book or who've seen the film, it kind of revolves around the same topic. The Green Book was a guide for African Americans throughout history of, you know, where were the safe havens, where was it safe to travel, whether it was restaurants, hotels, gas stations, grocery stores. So we did this piece in collaboration with Roger Ross Williams, who'd been wanting to tell a story about the Green Book for years. He approached us after seeing The People's House, and he wanted to collaborate on bringing his vision to virtual reality. He had never done that before. He came from the film, from a documentary film background. So after having multiple conversations with him, you know, at first he was thinking about fiction, and then we decided to, you know, take it one step at a time and say, well, your strength is documentary, let's start from there. And it's also an easier thing to explore in VR to begin with. And we came to an interesting concept. So, you know, he had thought about Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a restaurant in Washington, which was in the Green Book in a prior version of what it was. So it used to be a pool hall, and then it became a movie theater, and then it became Ben's Chili Bowl. And throughout the years, it remained a safe haven and kind of a hub for African Americans. And so we thought, okay, well, let's make an experience that would be entirely set in Ben's Chili Bowl, but that we would use Ben's as a kind of vehicle to travel through space and time without ever really leaving Ben's Chili Bowl. The way we did that was, well, we for one thing, we recreated Ben's based on references and photographs into what it used to be like in the 50s and 60s. And we sat the viewer at the table most of the time for these intimate conversations that were going to happen between characters telling their stories of whether it be, in this case, this is Samaria Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, the 12-year-old boy who was shot by a police officer a few years ago. And this is actually the first time she tells her story in this much detail, and you're sitting right next to her as this happens. You're a passive listener, but you're kind of a part of the conversation. And this is one of the most intense things we've ever shot, just in terms of the reactions we've been getting here. It's just people just can't keep it together. And this was also an opportunity for, you know, the Ben's Chili Bowl is on one side is flanked by this giant mirror, and we thought this could be a great opportunity to you know, kind of, I was talking about editing earlier without really editing, to use that reflection as a way to take us to illustrate things that the characters might be talking about, or to evoke certain feelings. In this case, as we're talking about the past of Ben's Chili, we use it to kind of create a reflection of that past. Or in the case here of a conversation about traveling on the bus in the 60s, was it in the 60s? I believe so, yeah. Again, to evoke that without actually showing it, without actually going and taking you somewhere else. Another thing we did in this piece was, you know, we had a lot of archival footage that we wanted to show, to tell stories that we, you know, this is two-dimensional footage in a 3D 360 medium, and we at some point had the idea, well, Ben's used to be a movie theater, so we could use it as the surface. It surfaces as a projection surface, basically, and again, kind of through the challenge of the through the challenge that this desire to use archival footage, we came to this, I think, creative solution that really enhanced the experience. This is a photo of the installation that we built at Sundance when we premiered the piece, and I think, you know, we took that immersion outside of the VR experience itself. We built a mini Ben's Chili Bowl at Sundance that you would literally walk into. You would sit down at the booth, and you would live the experience, which begins and ends at Ben's Chili Bowl. And again, this was a way to, and something we're doing more and more of these days, is thinking of the VR experiences not just what happens when you're in the headset, but what gets you in and how you get out of a virtual reality experience as well.
Okay, I want to just share a few more notes about Miyubi as we're talking about storytelling and strategies for storytelling inside of an immersive experience. So one thing that we did with Miyubi, because you're in the body of that robot, is try to find a way to justify moving from one scene to another scene, and how could we conceptually or diegetically justify that. And we thought, well, if you're a robot, then, and if you're a cheap plastic robot, then you might be slightly defective. And so one thing we could do is create glitches, you know, as if you were suddenly bugging and your sort of consciousness was shutting down. Or someone could actually turn you down inside of the experience. So there are moments where the kids are tired to play with you and they just approach you and they shut you down. And so that shuts your consciousness down. And the moment where someone turns you back on is the moment where your consciousness is revived, is activated again. And so that allows us to move forward through time. And every time that you get rebooted, we created a sort of a sequence that, you know, you have a snapshot here, but that kind of gives you the date, gives you like the reason why you crashed in the first place and all of that. So you get data of your activated consciousness, which helps to further increase your sense that you are this robot and you are experiencing the world through this robot's point of view.
Basically, Miyubi is literally, doesn't have a single non-diegetic cut. The entire editing of the piece is justified by the piece itself.
Another thing we did that we wanted to experiment with is to hide scenes and scenes that could only be revealed through sort of Easter eggs strategy. And so in the experience, there are 3 scenes in which you, if you look around in the environment, you see a toy. So in this case, it's a Pinocchio toy in the classroom scene where Miyubi is presenting you for an oral presentation that he's doing to his classmates. He's presenting his robot. And so if you look around, you will see that toy. And if you see that toy, it's going to have this kind of 8-bit animation, kind of cheesy 8-bit animation that is going to be triggered, and that toy is going to be added to an inventory that appears in your field of view, and you have no idea why that is.
Which also clues you into the fact that there are other things to find.
Exactly. And so when you find the 3 toys, then what happens is it opens up a portal, which looks sort of like a 8-bit version of the portal in 2001. We kind of always go back to the things that we liked at the beginning. And you enter that portal, and it takes you to an encounter with your creator, which is played by Jeff Goldblum. And so you meet your creator, who tells you the story of his attachment for you. It's almost like kind of a Geppetto-Pinocchio father-son relationship. And it's a very emotional moment about, you know, about creating something that for him is like a child, but in fact it's a product. And it's a monologue from Jeff Goldblum that's very emotional. But the truth is, if you don't do the Easter egg hunt, you will never see that scene. And so you might hear someone say, oh, I've watched this piece, Miyubi. I love the scene with Jeff Goldblum. And say, what are you talking about? I didn't see that scene. Or you might see his name on the poster, but he's not in the film, and you wonder why. And so you go and try to find him. So we kind of like that idea. And then we tried to push it to another level. We said, well, maybe when you meet with your creator, he should give you a secret. He should reveal something. And what he reveals in the piece is that he knows that one day you will become obsolete because you're just a toy, you're just a product. And he cares for you, and he says one day when you're no longer loved by the family that has adopted you, I will give you a special code that you can do just by moving your head. And so we went back to, for those of you who played Contra on Nintendo, to a up, down, left, right, series of head motions. And if you do that during the experience, it's going to transport you to what we call the inner sanctuary, which is sort of an 8-bit paradise. And so once you know that, then you go back into the scene, and you're like, is this really a thing? So you do it, you go with your head, you do it, and then boom, there's an 8-bit animation that transports you in that cheesy, beautiful place where there's a unicorn, you know, drinking by a river, and you're just there. And you can stay there for as long as you want. So if you want to be like for half an hour in the inner sanctuary, you can. And if you do the code again, it's going to transport you back in the story where you left off. And so the truth is, when we did that, we knew that not a lot of people would figure all of that out, you know, and we would sort of have to help them figure it out. But it turns out that the content is just that much more alive because it has those possibilities. And so when we think about Miyubi, we cannot have like a clear representation of the project because it has all of these kind of branches, and it just makes the content more lifelike in a way, because life is like that. And we really like that kind of thinking when it comes to VR storytelling.
And if you ever had any doubts about how awesome Jeff Goldblum is, I mean, the fact that he agreed to be in a film that almost no one would see him in, that almost no one would see to begin with, because it's a VR film, but that he would be hidden unless found was just amazing.
So, okay, a couple of notes, just for those of you who think about production and how it looks like. So, when we do,
I don't think this is the crowd for this.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll still give it a shot. So that is a Christmas scene that we film, for example. And so when we capture a scene, very often you see lights, and you see rigging arms, and you see stands, and you see the same kind of things that you would see on a film set. And then we shoot a plate, very simply, where we remove everything, and we just capture what is supposed to be there in the set, if it was truly an empty set, and then we comp that in post-production. So when you're in post, you don't see any lights, you don't see any piece of cinema gear hanging everywhere. So we do that all the time.
We often also have the camera itself be a source of light. So we have a ring of LEDs around the camera. We often use the ceiling. It's a good, the less overlap you can have between the things you want to erase and the characters in the scene is always a good thing.
And we also created another special moment inside of Miyubi that is the thing that Paul and I prefer about the whole thing, I think, is that there is a scene where the father in the family records on an old VHS camera a message for his son, because the father is a businessman, he's going on a trip, and he's going to miss Halloween. And for them, Halloween is the biggest family moment of the year, and he's not going to be there. And so it's another emotional moment where he's in front of the camera, he's costumed as Rambo, and he's doing this message for his son. And then so you're sitting next to him, and you see the camera right there, and then right there is a television that sends you the signal of what the video camera is seeing. And inside of the television, you see the father, and you see yourself. You see the little robot that you are filmed by that VHS camera. And if you move your head in the scene, you will see the little robot moving its head in perfect synchronicity with you. And it's such a subtle thing, but when you find that, it's like an epiphany moment. It just kind of, if you didn't feel immersed, it just kind of drills you right into it. You're forced into immersion in a way. It's like sleeping pills or something like that. So it just kind of, but it works. And that's another thing that many people don't necessarily find in the experience. But when you do find it, it just feels like that is a moment that belongs to you. You were not manipulated into seeing this. You discovered it on your own. And just like in real life, I'm free to explore reality the way that I want. And when you find that kind of freedom inside of a VR experience, and when it's rewarded in a way, it kind of elevates the emotional connection that you have with the content.
So Gymnasia is also one of our latest pieces, and our second stop-motion VR experience. This was actually, it's worth mentioning, made in collaboration with Chris and Maciek, Clyde Henry, who, by the way, we also collaborated on Strangers, the very first piece we had done, with Patrick Watson, who also collaborated on this piece, who did the soundtrack and whose son actually sings in the piece. So this was like a 5-year reunion of the original team. What we did on this piece, so this was a lot of what we had learned on the Wes Anderson Isle of Dogs companion piece, we kind of took to the next level on Gymnasia. First of all, we actually had 360-degree sets. We also, what we realized as we were creating this, because to shoot stop motion, and maybe I should talk about that a little bit, in VR, we can't use our actual camera because it's huge, and we also want to play with scale. We want to take these little puppets and make them feel life-size. So what we actually do is we made a virtual version of our virtual reality camera by basically using a single DSLR on a motor and using motion control. We would shoot, because nothing's moving, we would shoot every little camera separately, but moving them much less, right? So we're making a virtual tiny version of our VR camera. And that's how we did Isle of Dogs, and that's how we eventually did this. But what we realized when we were doing that is that, well, you asked about light fields, and light field cameras are, you need a lot more cameras to shoot light field. For those who don't know what a light field is basically when we shoot a cinematic virtual reality camera, we have a camera that shoots basically from one position. You can look in all directions and it's in 3D, but you can't move. With the light field camera, you can actually shoot a field of light, and you can move within that field. So that, usually that field is about as big as the camera itself. So most light field rigs are, something like this, right? So you can have a good, so you can have, a range of motion that's, you can't walk around the room like you would with something like photogrammetry or volumetric capture, but a light field gives you photorealism, gives you all the qualities of all the materials of glass, of reflections, refractions. What we realize is that, well, since we're shooting a virtual version already of our virtual reality camera, we could shoot a virtual version of a light field without actually having a light field camera, without having a real, life-size, full motion video light field camera. So we actually built, this is a photo of the light field rig we did. So we're basically using it as almost like those scanners. We basically have a row of cameras and we're scanning the scene, and that basically gives us a free, I mean, it wasn't free, but it's a form of light field. It's like jumping ahead in time of, to be able to capture this for real in the real world would be almost impossible and would cost a fortune. But since everything is static, everything is miniaturized, it allowed us to shoot a light field to kind of to shortcut to having a light field of a stop motion piece. So this is something that we've been working on, and that will be coming out soon. Yeah. Well, no, not the light field. Not the light field. So that we released the VR version, but not the non-light field version, I should say. Yeah. That's
cool. So that was kind of a roller coaster speed through some of our case studies that we wanted to talk in a little bit more depth with. But of course, as you've noticed, since the studio started, everything has kind of exponentially accelerated year over year in terms of learnings and the level of how ambitious the projects are. Space Explorers started in 2016, and here we are with a camera physically in space. So you see how a lot of things have just had forward momentum, and our projects have gotten increasingly immersive and increasingly interactive. So in talking about our future projects, maybe you guys could share a little bit about where we're going beyond VR now. So in terms of interactivity, you saw we were having fun with things in Miyubi, still within that VR environment, but we are now starting as a studio to dip our toes and go into AR and MR. Maybe you guys could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So what's worth mentioning is that from the very early days, even when we first met with Oculus and showed them Strangers, and they were like really, excited about cinematic virtual reality, from the very beginning, since they were developing the VR devices that had movement, positional tracking and control, hand tracking, they were like, they wanted us to create interactive content, and we didn't want to go there right away. Because honestly, we could spend the rest of our lives just exploring cinematic virtual reality and not reach the end of it. And second of all, as I said earlier, we had always had a very iterative approach to exploring immersive storytelling. And interactivity felt like a huge can of worms that needed to come after we'd understood much more basic, more fundamental aspects of immersive storytelling. 6 years later now, we feel like we have a strong enough foundation to start playing with interactivity. I mean, we already have, but the type of interactivity where you can actually move around and have that much more agency, I think has taken a while for us to wrap our heads around what that would mean for us. I mean, this is stuff that's been made for years. We're not pretending we're inventing anything here, but you know, for this type of interactivity to make sense to us, it needed to be a part of a process. And so, for about the last year and a half or so, we have been basically developing completely real-time rendered interactive projects, both in virtual reality, in mixed reality, augmented reality, because we were interested, but also for, you know, reasons that are, you know, the industry itself. There is a place for cinematic virtual reality, and there will continue to be a place, and I think there will be a bigger place once there is more adoption. But the advantage of interactive content today is that it can be, if it's designed with that in mind, it can be kind of inherently and natively cross-platform and more universal and accessible to people who even have smartphones and tablets and on their PCs. So a lot of the stuff we're developing today is with that in mind. So Felix also mentioned the museum exhibit, the traveling exhibit we want to do for the ISS project. That will be, yes, it will integrate the stuff we're shooting on the ISS, but it will also be a volumetric interactive exploration that will have hotspots within which you can enter this actual filmed footage. We're also thinking of ways of you know, using virtual production within a virtual reality experience to simultaneously create a virtual reality experience and a more traditional, oh, that's my parking, a more traditional television show or movie or something like that. One of the things we're very conscious and careful, please remind me not to forget.
You need to pay for parking 5 minutes from now. Yes.
One of the reasons, other reasons we've avoided going to the real-time rendering side of things is because to this day, you can't really have photorealism outside of live, you know, the type of stuff we've been doing. Light field can do it, but it's extremely complex and just barely getting there technologically. Volumetric capture can do it, but it never fully looks real, and you usually need to find a way to justify why it doesn't look real. Otherwise, it starts looking like a video game. And there's really a lot, I think, to say about photorealism when what you're trying to represent is the real world, real people. And to this day, if we're going to do that, we will prefer to shoot with the cameras that we have rather than do it volumetrically. For anything that is interactive or volumetric, we will do something that is stylized, that somehow justifies the aesthetics. We think that's very important because it's a balance of, you know, what you gain and what you lose. Like, full photorealism is worth something. The minute you give it up to have interactivity, well, the interactivity needs to make up for that. You can't just say, well, I'm going to do something. Well, you can, but if you just decide to do something interactive and you instantly lose photorealism and it all of a sudden looks like a video game, well, the thing with video games is they're great. Some of them are. They're great games. They're good at being games. And so a lot of the best VR stuff out there today is actually VR games because they're well-designed games. The trouble is this uncanny valley in the middle of things that are neither great stories, they can be good stories, or they're not great games. They're kind of in the middle. They're this interactive, somewhat story, and that's a very dangerous place to be in, at least in our perspective, and something we're very careful about, because if it's not going to be a great game, but it's going to look like a game, and it's not going to have the emotional impact of a film or a cinematic virtual reality piece, because your characters just can't look that way, it's a very, very tricky thing. Or if you're going to go into a more cartoony aesthetic, well, then again, you need to be careful. You're a human being in a cartoon world. You know, you need to be careful about how you stylize your world, even if you decide to stylize it, and why you're there. How, you know, there's something, when you're watching a cartoon on a screen, you're not asking yourself, why am I in a cartoon world? You're not in a cartoon world, you're watching a cartoon. But as a human being in a cartoon world, there's something there. It just creates that bit more friction, and it's one of those things that might work against immersion if you don't really think about it that much. And ultimately, it's a balance of all these things.
So I think Paul could actually do an entire other masterclass on interactivity. But I think what we're trying to get at is that that's kind of the future iteration of the studio is expanded into more interactive works, and the toolkit of technologies has just fostered more of that growth. So augmented reality technology kind of hinted, like there are glasses that are underway that could also provide us a new medium for immersive and interactive storytelling. So that's actually one of our current projects, is related to object-based storytelling and augmented reality as the platform for that, as opposed to our strong history in virtual reality. But you know, our projects are still, the very heart of them is a lot of virtual reality. And the ISS experience is a perfect example of that with Space Explorers and how it's coming underway. Felix, you kind of hinted at the fact that we are doing a traveling exhibition with it, but can you speak about how that project is kind of the perfect example in our studio of how projects are now starting to have multiple branches to them, and there is going to be an AR component to Space Explorers as well, and you know how that ecosystem is building?
Absolutely. So now when we do projects, contrary to when we began a couple of years ago, we think about creating different entry points into the story worlds that we create. So a project like ISS Experience, you might enter it or enter that world through the cinematic virtual reality series if you're a VR user. You might enter that world by going to the exhibition, and you will enter into a large-scale immersive experience, and then through that immersive experience, which we call the location-based approach, you will have access to the content. But we are also producing mixed reality and augmented reality companion experiences for the people that are interested in augmented reality. And so through those experiences, they can eventually get to the core content that we're building. And so more and more, this is how we are thinking about project, is creating multiple entry points, leveraging all of the different technologies out there that can lead towards the stories that we tell. And this is a new way of thinking that has started to really sort of impose itself in, I would say, virtually all of the projects that we do now. So, yeah.
Great conclusion. So we're bumping up against 12 here, but I'd love to open it up to the audience if there are any new questions from our second half of our presentation here. We've got one arm up there, and we got another here, and we got a third person over there. Okay.
Hi there, thanks. Fantastic work on Isle of Dogs, loved it. Can you talk a little bit about the toolkit that you're using now? There was a screenshot earlier with some cut video, and then the sort of finished product on the left. What software and in general the tool chain?
So generally speaking, the tool chain is, we use a lot of off-the-shelf things such as Nuke to do compositing. We use Premiere for editing, but then we use a lot of software we've written to control the camera, to process the footage,